Hi, everybody, and happy week 3. I thought that we should begin the semester, and we're still pretty much at the beginning, with a conversation about ethics and volunteers. Volunteer management is really just people management. And where there are people trying to work together, even for good, there will be amazing successes, but also, unfortunately, there will be disagreements, problems, insults, conflicts, and a full range of human emotion to go along with it. This video is designed to create a path forward through tough ethical messes. And I hope that by the time we get done with it, you will have some tools that you probably don't have right now. So when something tough comes up, you will know exactly how to handle it. And you may not have an easy answer using my system, but you will definitely know why you made the decision you did and be able to explain it. And that is so important. We'll talk about that more later. So before we go any further, I'd like you to pause the video and do the following thing. Get out a piece of paper and a writing tool and answer the questions that you see on the slide. Do you consider yourself an ethical person, and why or why not? I'm just going to sit here and wait for you. Do 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 do. Do, 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 do. Okay, I assume you've done it and you're back. It will be helpful later if you did do it. If you're just playing on through, then unfortunately you had to watch me hum. Anyway, let's get back to our discussion. If I were to sit across the table from you and ask you if you think you're an ethical person, 98% of you would say, absolutely, I'm an ethical person. And the other 2% of you would basically say, well, I try to be an ethical person, but sometimes I fall short. In other words, you all think you're ethical. And you would expect that in a class like a volunteering class, because the people that want to do that kind of work are generally people who are trying to do good, right? So of course you're all trying your hardest to be ethical. But if something can go wrong, it just might. And I want to make sure that you actually have all the tools so that you can feel good that you actually have made an ethical decision, even if you have a very complicated situation. So why is it that I'm pairing ethics and conflict? Well, ethical rules are basically rules that have been put into place to preserve human relationships. Ethical rules are only necessary when we're engaged with other people or groups or institutions. If we were all Robinson Crusoes on an island, we wouldn't need ethical rules. We could just do anything we want. But we can't. So ethical rules are basically put in place to govern how we interface with each other based on what our culture thinks is socially the right thing to do. In other words, we take our morals, which are right versus wrong, and we create rules to carry them out. All right, so do you know what it really means to be ethical? How would you define ethics? What we plan to learn in this few-minute video is the following learning objectives. Discover your own primary ethical approach, improve your ethical radar, figure out when something might have ethical implications, learn the 4 Western ethical frames that you will be held accountable for, explore the ethical duties of your role as a volunteer manager, and try your hand at putting some of these things into practice. We'll do that with a case study. So let's talk about where most of us learned our ethical perspective. Most of us probably learned it pretty early on from our parents or our teachers, our grandparents, religious educator. And usually the form it takes is rules, Don't pull your sister's hair. Don't lie. Don't do something to somebody else if you wouldn't like it yourself. The golden rule, right? When I was growing up, which is probably before all of you, there was a TV show on called Romper Room. And Romper Room had a regular segment about do bees and don't bees. Do bees were good. Don't bees were bad. Do bees were considerate and played quietly without making a mess, while don't bees ran all around the house, knocking things over and creating havoc and anxiety for their parents. Do bees always played safely away from the street, while don't bees played in the street. As kids, right and wrong were presented to us as a large stack of do's and don'ts. As we get older, that stack just gets higher. Don't cheat on your tests in school. Don't take credit for somebody else's ideas at work. Don't take office supplies from the office cabinet home for your personal use. We just have a lot of do's and don'ts. For most of us, unless we took a philosophy class somewhere along the way, or we had an amazing, wise mentor who sat us down and helped us peel back the layers of the onion on difficult ethical issues or conflicts, we probably don't really have anything beyond all these rules that we've learned to help us be more ethical. So the kinds of things where we need something beyond rules is the kind of situation where if we make one decision, Sally is going to be very happy, but Jimmy is going to feel like he's been abused in some way or hurt. But if we make the decision the other way, then it will reverse. Jimmy's going to be very happy, but Sally is going to feel marginalized. So these are complicated ethical dilemmas, and we need tools to sort them out. This video hopefully is going to give you these tools. All right, so there are 4 primary Western ethical models. There are actually more, and I'll just show you a few in a minute, but these are the 4 that in our society, in our culture, you will be held accountable. The problem is that most of us grew up in a household where maybe 1 or 2 of these ethical models or frames or lenses, the way we look at things, were sort of the way that our parents looked at things and taught us to look at things. And they probably didn't call them by these names. But what you will find, I think, as we talk about this is 1 or maybe 2 of these feels very familiar to you, and the others not so much. The problem is because our society holds you responsible for all 4 of them, it's important to recognize which way you learn to think about ethical things, and that's great. Set those to the side. Now let's take a look at the 2 or 3 that you aren't very good at, and let's see if we can strengthen your skills in those areas. Because if you try to solve a problem comes on your desk, and in very good faith and thinking about it a lot, you make the best ethical decision you can, but you've only looked at it in one of these frames. When your board member or your boss or a journalist is in your office asking you, why did you make this decision this way? And you tell them, they're going to ask you a whole slew of, well, why didn't you think of that? Or why didn't you think of this? Well, you didn't because that wasn't part of your primary ethical framework. So let's get into the primary ethical frameworks. I do want to say that doing an analysis on all 4 ethical frames takes a little bit of time. We're going to run through it kind of quickly, but I will leave you with some tools you can use to practice these things. But I want to just point out that it may take an hour or 2 hours or even a couple of meetings to go through this kind of analysis that I'm about to teach you before you get to a decision, and that may seem like a lot of time. But if you are in trouble afterwards because you didn't do this, trust me, it will be a much bigger headache. Sorry about the moving around of the camera, but where my laptop is sitting is not comfortable. All right, so before we dive in to these 4 ethical ways, I'd like again to ask you to pause the computer, and I have included a volunteer case study about a medical library, and it's short. I'd like you to pause, pull that up on your computer or print it off and read it, because as I'm going through these, I'm going to use it as an example, and if you haven't read it, you won't even know what I'm talking about. So then come back and we will start again. Do, 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 do. Alrighty, here we are again. The first ethical frame that we are all responsible for is called teleology. And this is a Latin word that basically has to do with the greatest happiness, the greatest well-being, the consequences, the utilitarianness, if that's a word, of a decision that you might make. In other words, which choice of action in front of you will bring the greatest happiness or the greatest well-being for the biggest number of people. If you were thinking about where to put a medical clinic, where is it going to serve the most people? Now, that may or may not be an ethical question, but it's to show you how we're looking at this. So basically, it's what we call a cost-benefit analysis. The extension or the expansion of the idea of cost-benefit is we're not just talking money. We could be talking all the different kinds of costs and benefits that any situation gives to us. We'll talk in a minute about how we do a teleological analysis. Or maybe I'll just do it this way now. Let's see if I can find it. All right, here we go. So the teleological questions that you have to ask to do a teleological analysis is basically who is hurt by a decision or who is helped? Who all are affected directly or indirectly, and how are they affected? And what are the long and short-term consequences, both good and bad, of a particular decision you'd like to make? And what are all the costs and benefits of this action choice? All right, so these are the questions, and these will be your tools. Now, if you think about your case study, I would just suggest that this is a good time to write up a list of all the people that are involved, or at least the main people that are involved, and look at the volunteers, look at the medical librarian, think about the families that are coming in there. Who else is more indirectly involved? What about the head of nursing who picked the students? What about funders and donors and partners in the community? How are they going to be impacted? Who is going to be hurt? Who's going to be helped? And what are the long and short-term consequences of the solution you think maybe should be put into play? All right, now let's go back and find the next. The second frame is called deontology. Deontology is basically the question, what principles or rules should we apply here? The one that we all know the best is the golden rule. What you don't like, don't do to someone else what you don't like done to you. But we will see that in every situation, there are rules that should be applied. So let's just think about our volunteer management case study a little bit. And let me pull up the questions for deontology. You're going to ask what principles apply in this situation. And you're going to double check yourself, kind of like math, by saying, could I or would I apply these same principles consistently in this case and other cases? And the reason we ask that is because we may like or dislike a person when we have an issue, and we might want to apply leniency to somebody we like that we would never apply if we didn't know the people and we were just asking. So applying a principle has to be done consistently. So let's just think about one principle, and I'm going to ask you to think about more on your own, but one principle that should apply to this medical library case study. Well, one principle is that everything that happens in that medical library case study has to move that library's value towards succeeding to accomplish its mission. If the mission is to help all of these families, then that is a principle you've got to apply. What would be the thing that most helps the families? Now, you might say firing the 2 nurses, but then you have to say what other principles apply. And if you think about it, nonprofits have the principle of inclusion and diversity. And so how do those two principles conflict with each other? That is a question that you guys would have to debate out in your organization if this happened. And there are other principles too that you want to apply here. What do you want your, what principles do you want to apply to the nursing school that is your partner, and so on and so forth. So these are the questions that you would need to ask. I'm not going to bring them all up for you because I'd like you to, maybe practice thinking up a couple questions on your own. All right, the next frame is the virtue frame, and I call it the what would blank do frame. And many of you actually probably do have, or even occasionally wear, wrist bracelets that say, what would Jesus do, what WWJD. And I think that's, one of the most popular role models to look at when we're thinking about to be ethical. Many people basically say to themselves, oh, what would Jesus guide me to do? Or what would Jesus have done in this situation? What would he have said about the situation? But, that fill in the blank doesn't have to be Jesus. I happen to be Jewish. So for me, Jesus isn't my guy. And my blank filler is much closer to home. I had the benefit of my grandmother's wisdom for many years. I was the oldest grandchild. And she shared many thoughts about the world with me and how to look at problems. And so when I get into a sticky situation, I sometimes ask myself, what would my mama, I call my grandmother mama, what would my mama have advised me to do? Or what might she have, what steps might she have taken in this case, or what might she have said? But again, it doesn't have to be a deity. It doesn't have to be a family member. It could be anybody that you look up to that you think has integrity and wisdom, and that you might be able to get some clues about good ethical behavior from. Jesus, Mohammed, Moses, Gandhi, Maimonides, Martin Luther King, Golda Meir, Cesar Chavez, Warren Buffett, Hillary Clinton, or not, the emails, Oprah, Bono, whoever it is. So, Zadie, by the way, is a Jewish word for grandfather. So let's look at the questions that you need to ask. The interesting thing about a virtue analysis is that it goes beyond who do we want to role model ourselves to, and ask the questions about what does it mean, what does a particular action choice mean about me? What does it seem like my character is if I do this? What will it do to my reputation or the reputation of the organization? How might it set an example for others? And what would someone whose character I admire do? Again, that virtue question, WW blank D. So when you are thinking about the medical case study, you've got to ask yourself, if you let these two nurses go, what is it going to do for your reputation about being diverse and inclusive? If you don't let them go, what will it do to your reputation? So these, and how do you want to look out into the community? What do you want people to think about your organization? These are a completely different way of looking, not what's the best good, but what is our reputation? How are people going to see us? Will they think we have integrity? Okay, so the last frame is intuition. This is the I know it in my gut. I walk in a room and I get a warm fuzzy about somebody or a conversation that's going on. Or conversely, I feel like the hair stand up on the back of my neck and I just don't want to be around this person, or I really think this is wrong. This is so right. This is so wrong. This is intuition. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit. But first, I want to help you figure out what your primary ethical frame is. And you may have recognized it as we were talking about these, but do you remember the first written exercise you did where you answered whether you're an ethical person and told me where your ethics came from? If you go back and take a look at that, you should be able to see whether your answer to me about where your ethics came from is based on rules, is based on trying to do the best good for the most people, or is based on character or, modeling yourself after someone. Whichever thought came out when you made that example, that is your primary ethical lens. And that's great. Whatever it is, you are already ahead of the game on that. So, but what you will want to do then is pay attention to making sure that you are thinking about the other ethical lenses. Now, just for fun, let's talk about some other ethical frames. Literally, ethics are situational and cultural, and there are a zillion ethical frames out there. So, three that we might all be familiar with that I just like to point out to you are karma, Native American, and feminist ethics. And the reason I point out karma, even though it's kind of actually a subset of a larger ethical frame, based on an Eastern religion, is that a lot of us in the West like the idea of karma and have sort of incorporated it into our portfolio. So that's fine. You can use an additional ethical lens beyond the four. Just know that you will absolutely be required to answer to the four. Probably your board member or the journalist that comes to see why you did this bad thing are not going to ask you about karma, but they will ask you about the questions that go with the four other frames. All right, so another one is there's a Native American ethic, and I like this. Be tolerant of those who are lost on their paths. Ignorance, conceit, anger, jealousy, and greed stem from lost souls. You can see that this is very different than our Western perspective. Ignorance, conceit, anger, jealousy, and greed stem from basically evil people, right? That is not at all the Native American ethic. And of course, that's not their only ethical thought. But I think that this is a really good example of how a culture that is within a culture, our larger culture, nevertheless looks at the world very differently than the rest of us. And the last one we're going to look at is a feminist ethic. And since I'm making this on the same day that I went to the Women's March this morning, seems like a good time to look at it. And I won't read it to you, but basically this is a ethical, I don't know what you want to call it, a little thing to think about, I guess, from a feminist website. And again, this is about caring, and it's an approach, right? And so if that is your first approach, if kindness and caring is your highest value, as opposed to individualism might be your highest value, if you think about that, then you can see that it might change the way you make a decision if kindness and caring is your highest value. All right, so those are just three other ethical frames, but there are many others. Different religions have their own ethical frames and so forth. I just wanted to let you see what I'm talking about when I say there are more. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we know about these different ethical perspectives, how do we make sure we don't miss anything? I've shown you the questions to ask, but to make it easier to be specific about how you ask those questions as opposed to asking them very generically, the trick is actually to create a stakeholder list and then ask the questions specifically to each stakeholder. And this is where the process gets kind of long. A stakeholder list is a list of all the people who care about the decision you might make. There will be some who are very directly impacted, like the nursing students, the families in the library, and so forth. But there will be other people for whom the impact still exists, even if it's indirect. Thinking about our case study, it might be the university where the nursing school is. It might be board members or funders who would have an opinion one way or the other about what you decide. When we think about this volunteer case study, then you make this list of who uses the library, who funds the library, who's involved with the choices, and who are the partners, and so forth. I would like to invite you to pause this video right now and actually make your own fuller list of everyone who might be impacted directly or indirectly. And then after you've done that, in the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit more about where this can go. Okay, I'm assuming you have your list. I suppose probably half of you don't, but hopefully you made it in your head. So here we are again at the teleological questions. And now instead of just rattling off these questions, you have a list of different people that you need to ask about. So the question really is, if we made the decision to let the nursing students go, the ones who did not speak English easily, or were not easily understood, I guess I should say, you would be able to make more specific questions. You would be able to ask, how would the nursing students be impacted by this? What would it look like on their resume? How might it impact their college career and various stuff like that? So you could personalize it. Same thing with with say your funders. We heard that you released two people just because they were from a foreign country and their English was not perfect. We really think we need to be diverse, and we don't want to support an organization that will not be inclusive and support people from different backgrounds. That's something somebody could say. So when you think about how a funder might be impacted and what would be the consequences to the organization and to the funder, then those are how you make more specific these questions. Same with the deontological questions. You can now look at your list and say, what principle, what principles do I apply to how I treat volunteers? What principles need to apply to how we apply the mission and to our families that come use us? So you can basically be much more specific. With virtue character traits, you can say, for example, what would letting these two people go due to my working relationship or my reputation with the nursing school? What would it, so on. You can make up these questions, but my point is you can make them much more specific. And finally, intuition. And I want to go a little bit more into the intuition before I bring it back to the case study. Intuition gives us a very fast moral compass, but also sometimes it can be fallible. It turns out we are not as rational and linear thinkers as we think we are. There's a lot of science around the idea that we actually, in our brains, are seeking patterns. And the reason for that is when we walk into a situation, we start subconsciously matching what we see to previous experiences, either our own or things stories we've been told or situations we've read about. And it's a heuristic that our brain does to save us time. It's basically not a real computer, but it's like basically in there running through all your files in your brain, metaphorically speaking, of course, and looking for similar situations. And the reason is we walk into a room, something's going on, we have maybe 3 or 4 or 30 minutes at the most to make an assessment of it. And so we need a shortcut. And our brain looking for something that is similar. And how do we feel about it? How do we handle it? Did it make us feel good or bad? Did it work out well or poorly? Should we run? All of this we are projecting from past situations. So here's the thing. Usually this serves us pretty darn well. But the problem is we can't really know whether the thing that our brain found for us is close enough match that it should be projected into this situation. And so what we have to do is ask whether the experience that we are remembering subconsciously, and I'll talk about how do we make it conscious in a minute, whether this thing we're remembering is the same enough. So the way to do that actually is just to say to yourself, very simply, what does this remind me of? Is there any story or any experience I've had that this reminds me of? Usually, your brain is pretty quick to tell you what that is. It's right below the surface. So then you can say, well, let me just look more carefully at this situation. It's got some surface similarities, but it's got some big differences too. So then you say, well, those big differences are so big that I really do have to take a separate look at this. And I'm going to do my other 3 frame analyses on it too. I'm not just going to trust my intuition without checking it. The same way you would check your math, you need to check your intuition. So what is an intuition checkup? Well, you ask, what memories, experiences, or stories does this remind you of? And then you look at the thing that your mind tells you this is reminding you of, and you ask, how closely does the current experience match the past one? Is it truly a valid comparison? And the last thing you should really do is try to poke holes in your own story. You should doubt before defending. It turns out in Western civilization, we tend to get an idea, dig in our heels, and defend it without actually, looking for what the problems are. It's so smart to take a few minutes to work through whatever problems there are and then adjust your action choice if necessary to account for those things. All right, so your gut, to sum this up, might be very useful, and you shouldn't ignore it, but you should at least explore it to see whether or not it's a good enough match. Okay, now I would like to talk to you about something that we haven't talked about yet. There's a guy named James Svara. He used to teach at ASU, actually. He's moved on, but he came up with this thing called Svara's triangle. And you can see we've got the virtue, we've got the consequences, teleology, the principles, deontology on the corners of this triangle. And that's because he's acknowledging that there's analyses that need to be made. But he also puts duty right smack dab in the middle of the triangle. And his point is that we all have duties that come out of the roles that we have. And it's very important for us to actually first, before any of these other analyses, and I'm not sure they have to be done first, but as far as said, first we need to ask ourselves, what are our duties in this situation? So let me talk a little bit about duties. We all have duties. If you happen to be a parent, you know that your duty to your child is to, put a roof over their head and keep them fed and comfort them when they need comfort and keep them safe and so on. When you become an adult child of aging parents, the duties switch up. Now the kid is responsible for making sure that the parent has, some kind of dignity as they get older and they have their medical care that they need and that their living situation is sufficient for their health and well-being and so forth. Professionally, we have role duties too. If you think of doctors, we all know that their first duty is to do no harm. And your role as a manager of volunteers also carries very specific duties. One way to think about what those duties might be is to, again, go back to your list of impacted people and ask yourself, what do I owe each of these people or groups? When you're thinking of what do you owe volunteers, answers like careful screening and training, help integrating them into the organization and with the staff, and maybe, in the case of these volunteers, giving them a fair chance and the help that they need. What are the duties that you think that your job requires you? And then you can go and ask the same kind of questions. What are your duties to these families that are coming in to use the library? All right, so let's just take a look really quickly at some nonprofit duties. These are just, you could probably make a much longer list, but these are just some duties that if you're volunteer managing out of a nonprofit, you would have to think about. You have a duty to be committed to the mission. You have a duty to be committed to the larger public good, and so on and so forth. And when you get down here, you have inclusiveness and social justice, respect for pluralism and diversity. So you have some problems in your duties that still leave you with a conflict. But this is kind of the question that you have to ask, along with the virtue, the deontology, and the teleology analyses. Okay, so now I'm just going to veer off in a totally different direction. Most of you work for or have worked for or volunteered for organizations that have ethical codes. Ethical codes are great. I have provided you one in the same place I provided you the case study from, I think it's Health Science Librarians, which seems pretty much right on point. I'm going to ask you to pull up that code so that you can see it and look at it and ask yourself, which of the statements in this ethical code give you the solution to your problem? In fact, what I'm really asking is, is there enough guidance in an ethical code like this that actually addresses all of the multiple conflicts in this case study? The problem with ethical codes is they're just a snapshot of the concerns that the writers had or could think up at the time they created the code. They can't possibly anticipate every single situation that would come up. It's pretty clear to me when I look at the health science librarian's ethical code that they weren't thinking about what happened if you get two volunteers who are eminently well qualified, except they have trouble communicating for a little bit until you get used to their accents. That is not in the ethical code. There are some things that you could say apply, but they're very generic, right? So, again, I'm trying to point out that you have to go the long way, the long analysis, because even our ethical codes rarely cover adequately the kinds of conflicts that we are going to encounter. All right, so where am I? I think I'm done. I'd really like it if you would try your hand at this case. And in fact, I'll give everybody extra credit who does it. And what that would look like would be making a list of stakeholders and then going through a teleological, a deontological, a virtue, an intuition, and a duty analysis, meaning figure out what questions you need to ask. And then now you've got all the information out on the table. There still might not be a clear-cut answer, but you should know, you'd be able to see, oh, this seemed more important to me, and this is why. And you'll be able to explain yourself. So I will offer you extra credit. I will, if you want to do that, and I will put up a little set of instructions for you so that if you want the extra credit, you can get it. And I'm so glad to finish this before 40 minutes. It was still pretty long. Thank you for bearing with me. I hope you found it a little bit interesting.